the Ascended Masters address the Christian community worldwide and pose a series of questions to you. These questions are not at all intended to embarrass, to upbraid, or in any way cause anyone to feel as if they are being put down. Rather, these questions are intended to elicit clear and profound thinking and considerations that bear upon the system of your faith, elements of which you have taken for granted your entire career as a Christian. There's nothing like a dose of such insightful, penetrating questions to clear your spiritual sinuses, to act like smelling salts, spiritual smelling salts that are applied to your breath, that you might awaken from a form of almost unaware sleepwalking as you are walking through life, taking many things for granted, things that really should be cause for consideration, especially as this series of questions has everything to do with you. For example, let us begin with a question that might seem to be simple on the surface, but is not. The question is, who are you really? What is your makeup, really and truly? Are you just your physical body? If you're more than your physical body, what is that something more that you are? In addition to who you are and what constitutes that you are. And this is not a play on words. What makes you, you, rather than someone else? Even twins are separate selves. So what is it that constitutes that which makes you the unique person that you are? The next question: when did you, as you, begin? When did you start being who you are, whoever that might be? Was it at conception? Was it at the moment when the doctors and nurses delivered you and you took your first breath of air? Is that when you began? If that is your understanding of when you began, unless you're over 100 years old, Are you ready to deal with the necessary conclusion that 101 years ago, you did not exist by your own definition? That you began at conception, you began at birth? Are you merely the passive product of your environment? Is that who you are? Did you spontaneously combust and blink into existence out of nothingness at the moment of your birth? Or at the moment of your conception? Is that who you are? Will you continue on when your physical body is no more? The you that you are, will that continue on? If it does, and it's not your physical body, what is it? If you began at conception, who and how was that process produced? Is it your understanding that God or God's Son or the Holy Spirit is like some blacksmith at the forge of life, manufacturing yous, souls, selves, minting them like coins in a foundry? Is that how you came into existence when you did? Does that mean that God is waiting for parents to conceive and then running in at the last possible second and saying, okay, I've got to manufacture a brand spanking new soul to pair up with this fetus in the womb? Is that what takes place? Is that how it comes to pass? You might think, since all of these have to do with your identity, your present and your future and your past, that these would be keenly important questions that you would care to know about. For after all, as we've already established, there's no room for reincarnation or the pre-existence of you in Christianity of the first 20 centuries of Christianity. I would venture to say that if we were to give everyone a pop quiz and hand out this series of questions and have you write an essay answer to every one of those questions, most of your answers would probably be like the kind of answers that someone gives in a test when they don't know the answer. And they have to fill the page with a lot of words, a lot of self-evident generalities that are nothing more than circular reasoning and end up not adding one iota of real information in the process. As a little bit of research and background, you can Google soul or Christian soul definition. And I challenge you to find anything that isn't either a historical review of, well, certain philosophers thought this, certain groups in the past thought that, a whole history lesson of what previous people have thought and what the arguments pro and con were about all of that. But there, precious little, if anything, really and truly about details about who and what you are. Where did you come from? Of course, if you believe that you blinked into existence at the moment of conception, presumably there wasn't a you before that to come from anywhere. Can you see how this could be a void of ignorance that has been left more or less neglected and ignored and overlooked in the history of Christianity thus far? I'll give you two somewhat cursory attempts to try to figure this out or to explain it. This is one generally accepted way of addressing these issues. Most Christians understand the soul as a something, a reality that is distinct from and yet connected with the physical body. This something is described in moral terms, in spiritual terms, and sometimes even philosophical terms. One philosopher of religion at Oxford University wrote, "Souls are immaterial subjects of mental properties, possessing sensations and thoughts, desires and beliefs, and performing intentional actions. They are essential parts of human beings." Having heard that answer, do you know anything more than you did before I read it to you? Decidedly not. It's one of those fudged essay answers that I was describing a few minutes ago. Accordingly, when people die, their souls will be judged by God, and it will be determined whether they go to heaven or to hell. Through all branches of Christianity, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, Ecumenical, and Mainline Protestant, they all teach that Jesus plays the decisive role in determining whether it is going to be heaven or hell. Some believe that the soul is really no more than the vitality or the life that's associated with the body, and that when the body dies, the body is asleep and will stay asleep until the second coming, when it will wake up again and once more be a living soul. That is from certain Old Testament ideas about the same concept. You might recall the vision of Ezekiel that was turned into a very rousing gospel song about them bones, them dry bones. The valley of bones of all of those who had been good when they were alive, whose bones were buried, that would be resuscitated at the final end times, and come out of the graves and be alive. I guess if you could believe that you blinked into existence with your birth, it's not such a leap to believe that you would blink out of existence again at the death of your body, and then at some future time, the second coming or something, that you would once again blink into existence and go on. Hence, the stress laid on preserving that physical body so that it could blink back into life when those dry bones are resurrected. About the only place from Genesis to Revelation that the nature of this that you are is at all discussed or described with any attempt is a precious few verses in the beginning of Genesis, where it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, to have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and the cattle, and the earth, and every creeping thing. And so God created man in his own image." Doesn't say how, but it's evident that man is one of the things that God created, along with all the rest of the things that God created. You know, the heavens and the earth, the waters, the dry land, the creeping things, the fowl, all of the different things that were created. One of those things was the human race that God created. And then a few verses later, a little bit more about that process is explained. It says, "The Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul." Just that one verse. So, essentially, you have God taking clay, taking ground, earth, and making a mannequin, making a doll shaped like a human being. That was basically just that. And then there is, as is shown, this touch that took place between God the Father and the first man, Adam. It shows in the Sistine Chapel, that famous image of God reaching forth and touching the fingertip of the human being at that moment when the breath is transferred. And when the breath is transferred, the clay becomes a living soul. And so your selfhood starts with the earth, earthy, to which is added not the Spirit of God, but just this thing which is called breath of life. Which, by the way, that breath is not exclusive to human beings. All other living things share in that breath of life. It just puts man kind of at the top of the pecking order, a little bit higher, but still born out of the ground, the dust of the earth. A few verses later, this subject is addressed once again, when after the episode with the serpent and the forbidden fruit of the apple, God speaks to Adam thusly: "Because you have hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, Thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake, and in sorrow you shall eat of it all of the days of your life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat of the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, until you return unto the ground. For out of the ground wast thou taken. For dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. In other words, just as God conveyed this breath of life, when God takes away the breath of life, the human being returns back to that status of the dust. And really and truly, scripturally speaking, from Genesis to Revelation, although there are various synonyms for these terms, precious little more is added. We'll get into this a few sessions later. There is the idea of the heart in addition to the soul and the mind, but the heart, in many places, the verses read something like, the heart is deceitfully wicked, and out of the heart proceed all types of abominations. And if you care, we can go through all of the horrible things that come out of the heart. And if man is dust, and if man is fallen, and out of the heart come all of these things, and you look within, the heart is presumably the center of the self, of the you that you are in your soul. It leaves a pretty low opinion of who and what you are and how you came to be. That is, scripturally speaking, about all that could really be said on this subject. And of course, with that desultory, it's more than dubious. It's downright depressing, this view of who and what a person is. The whole remedy for all of that is that somehow or another, the one Son, Jesus, the one Son of God, Jesus, shares some of Jesus' own grace to mitigate that fallen soul, and somehow or another continue on the process of its existence, but never, ever allows it to ever forget its origins as a creature. What is a creature? A creature is something that has been created by a creator. Everything that is created passively, that didn't decide to be created, but that was created by a creator, is a creature that is basically the passive recipient of that act of creation. And so that is the yoke, if you wish to call it that is hung around the neck of every human being in the estimation of the Old and New Testament faiths, including Christianity. Are you content with that? Will you accept that definition of your selfhood with all of its ambiguities? And will you take it as a crown of thorns and insist on pressing it into your own brow, browbeating yourself, insisting with clenched teeth and a closed fist and a closed mind that is your nature. That is who and what you are to the best of your ability to at all approach an understanding of it. Hopefully you will see that this is definitely something that is frozen in time, as it was thousands of years ago. And that really and truly there has been no progress in rehabilitating the identity of what a person is. And that is where we leave off and move into the advancements in understanding the nature of you, of who and what your selfhood is. And starting from another starting point altogether than the dust and ashes of the earth. Isn't that what they say when the priest or the minister is giving the ceremony as the coffin is lowered into the ground? Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return. The advancements in this, as they have been shared with us by those who see clearly because they have gone into the heart of the reality of God, and they see clearly the record of all that is going on now, all that has ever gone on, all that has gone on in time and space, and are able to read the record that is the book of life of you. You have and are a book of life, a tree of life that makes you you. And the simple truth is that it doesn't start with the dust and ashes of this physical earth at all. The simple truth is that it starts with God the One, God the Good. It starts with God as this absolute one presence that has been set forth for you. And trust me, you have not even seen the tip of the iceberg of that understanding of God's presence and his expression, the reality as the one and the good. When we speak then about who and what a human being is in this earth, we must begin with God. And we must realize, although it might take a lifetime to actually assimilate the truth, we must realize that this God, the one God of very gods, has wonderfully and magically and mystically has as that cohesiveness of its own awareness and self-awareness. This presence has focused that awareness and has affirmed the awareness that it knows itself to be. Focused that to a point of individuality, where that one presence affirms and focuses, lo, I am, and holds that at a high, transcendent level of reality, far above anything that you can imagine as time or as space, and even above what would be called the eternal now, even above what would be considered the universal expression of God. Above that, God is focused to a point of individuality. This is something that God does. This is something that God is. Not something that any lesser part of life pipes and demands of the Godhead. This is something that God himself does at that level. And the simple truth is that it is something that the presence does countless times, simultaneously. God is I-amming, and I-amming, and I-amming, and I-amming. And all of those are profoundly one, while simultaneously each is distinct. And they are all within the allness of that oneness, of that presence. The underpinnings of this, the philosophical or cosmic law action of this, is something that the Ascended Masters have dealt with at great length here at the Temple of the Presence. And they have initiated a new impulse, which it will take their students and the world hundreds and thousands of years to assimilate these ideas, come to terms with them, and master them, to realize it. Simply put, in ways that you can at least use as a focus of your attention and your meditation and your study, what some would call an anchor point of a talisman. Simply put, say to yourself, God individualized. God individualized. And that is where the root of your selfhood, what will eventually become your soul, that is where the root of that is to be found. In the one God. At that level. God individualized. I would hope that regardless of what world religion or faith anyone may have, where there is at least a belief in God, that everyone would be humble enough before the presence of God to acquiesce to the actions of that presence of God and bow before that presence in honor of what God has elected to do, even if it disagrees with their misconceptions and preconceptions about how God ought to conduct himself. And where Christians are concerned, this is true as well. They should be willing to bow and acquiesce, at least starting with the argument, if God were to do this, individualize numberless times, if that were something that God did, do, and elected to do, and sustains the focus of that allness of himself as these many individualizations, who would we be, who would they be, to lecture the Almighty about the falsity of that, the wrongness of it, because it exposed a discrepancy in their own theological understanding of true religion. So God has individualized. And although we have to use words, we have in the English language past tense, present tense, future tense. There is no eternal tense for what God does before time. There is not in our language really a tense for that. So the trap of language is not something that should be erroneously superimposed upon this process, because it is not something that took place in the past. It isn't something that is going to, in a sense, take place in the future. It is something that is in the eternal, that never has not been, that never will not be. It really didn't happen in the beginning. It happened before in the beginning. And it happens as those constant moments in eternity and prior to eternity. That is where this individualizing, focusing of God's one consciousness takes place. There is a gradual process that we will oversimplify for the time being here today, whereby from those highest levels above what you would call the heaven world. I just mentioned this to you. If you go back to Genesis, Genesis says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So he didn't just create the earth, but he created the spiritual heaven worlds as well. And he created them when time began. Time began in the beginning, when out of the timeless, spaceless, eternal realm, God entered into the 6 days' work of creation, which does come forth. But these individualizations were there as Elohim, as the plural deity, the one many of these individualizations have always been. They are without father, they are without mother, without beginning or ending of days. And here is something that is very important. They were not, even these individualizations, they are not creatures of a creator God. These individualizations are the very deity that is an undivided part of themselves that has and does individualize. If you have ever tried to grapple with the mysteries of the Christian Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and you consider that all of these are eternal, in that sense, you may attribute that to the individualizations of God. So, the formula for you, the true you, the permanent you, the bigger you than the outer you. The formula for that you is, first of all, the presence of the one. And that is the presence part of the formula of I am presence. Then there is the allness of that presence that is represented in the am of the I am presence. That is the allness, that is the universality, that is the overlapping sense of oneness that all of these individualizations have. And then there is the individuality of the I, of the am and the presence. So the I is where the uniqueness of your selfhood has its fountainhead, its sourceless source, in the uniqueness of that individuality. That's the I of the self that you are as I am presence. All of the I's, if you will, are embracing and overlapping and enveloping all of the other I's of the oneness of the presence. So everyone's I is individual and distinct. Everyone's am overlaps every other I and every other am. And then all of the I ams are themselves grounded in the presence. The closest analogy I could give to you of this process, just as a crutch. It's a sorry crutch, but it's better than no crutch at all. The closest analogy I could give to you, remember we established that the one won't agree to be other than one. And we mentioned that, for example, that results in a tendency to cohere to itself. The one will never snap in two. The one will never be chopped in two. There's this cohesive sense about it. And in the analogy of water, if water is in weightlessness and in an atmosphere and in liquid form, but still weightless, and left to its own devices without any turbulence in the air in that weightless state, as I understand it, that water will gradually assemble itself into a sphere, a perfect geometric globule, because that's as close to each other as the molecules of water can position themselves. Once they get to that point, they're at kind of a stasis. So in that closeness, in that oneness, and let's initially say still, total stillness of that water. The stillness, motionless water is an analog or a rough analogous to the one, the presence. And then this one, it happens to look in upon itself. It has a self-awareness universally. And as that happens, there is a simultaneous reciprocation that takes place. We'll do first one example of it. Let's say we start with the focus as the point of I, and we cause an impulse to focus on that point of I. That will cause a circular wave to travel around the perfect sphere where it will come together on the other side. And in time, that wave will envelop the entire one. Yes, it may come together into another point, which is another theme for another day about twin flames. But that will also go back to the first. The wave will bounce and come back to the first. So now you have a point as an I, and you have this wave that is enveloping the whole of the one, which is the am. Regardless of how many points of focus there may be, all of those waves pass through all of the other points of individuality, so that they could be well said to be within each other. And that is the way that it is. I and my Father are one, but also I am one with every other one. When you ascend, the hem of the garment of your ascended presence will be that amness of the allness of God that will be totally encompassing. And as you look not out, because there is no out, but as you investigate yourself, you will find every other part of the Godhead is within, including the kingdom of God. Not the kingdom of heaven, but the kingdom of God is within. All of the other ascended masters, all of the other parts of life, the whole cosmos is really within the amity of the presence, the God self, the God presence, whom you are. This formula of I, coupled with am, coupled with presence, is a formula that has been given to us scientifically by our great, great teacher, who was given the new name Saint Germain upon his ascension. He had many illustrious embodiments. He was Francis Bacon, Roger Bacon, Christopher Columbus. He was a Neoplatonic philosopher, Proclus. He was Plato, Hesiod, Samuel, and Joseph, the father of Jesus and consort of Mother Mary, to name a few of his illustrious embodiments. He is the one who has taught us what you have heard shared with you today. It is truly an advancement in the understanding of Christianity. And in all of that, it hasn't lowered the merit or the identity of Jesus as the Son of God one whit. Jesus hasn't been taken down a peg and made commonplace. This path is not about reducing everyone to the lowest common denominator, but rather elevating everyone to the highest that they share, which is the presence of God, that they all share in common. Jesus had that awareness while he was alive, saying so very many things, like, if you've seen me, you've seen my heavenly Father. And he was referring to his mighty I am presence. He said, I and my Father are one. And he said something very enigmatic that would be very difficult to understand if you did not actually have this new vision of identity and of selfhood, which, by the way, we've yet to even get to the stage of what has been called the soul, the so-called soul of humanity. We're still at the stage of what is really the divine self, the God self of man. And Jesus expressed that when he said, before Abraham was, I am. In other words, before the patriarch was born or lived, I am. Notice he didn't say, before Abraham was, I was before Abraham was. He said, before Abraham was, I am. stepping out of the whole of past, present, and future, speaking from the vantage of his own God identity, which is in the eternal, before past, present, or future, before Abraham was. I am. We're going to follow this, where this path leads us, starting with that point of origin as the focus of God individualized, which is always a focus of the allness of that Godhead. Suffice it to say that this focus of the Godhead maintains stations of its own selfhood and consciousness. Pinpoint singularities of its own individuality that are basically described as the heart of the God self, the heart presence or the heart flame of the God self. And those heart flames of the God self are breathing, I am. And in the course of one inhalation and exhalation, all of eternity and all of time and space are embraced and brought back to the point of center for more of those breaths, fire breaths, to issue forth. That focus is able and does issue forth without ever abandoning its station in the one. That focus of individuality is able to pour forth its heart flame along what is called the tree of life or the river of life. The tree of life expresses how this life of this individualization pours forth after realms of creation have been created, after they've come to pass. Then comes, if you will, various levels of this heart of the individualization, building up vehicles for its own use. Some of these vehicles exist above the heaven world, in the realm of eternal being. We have received from Saint Germain an eye picture, a portrait of this individuality that we are. You see it on either side behind us here on the platform, both expressing the alpha qualities as well as the omega qualities. The topmost central figure is the wedding garment that Jesus spoke of. It is a garment that is a celestial body temple made without mortal hands, that is eternally youthful in that realm of eternity. That wedding garment is more scientifically described or defined or denominated the electronic body. It is the body that the individuality of the God self, that the individuality of the presence uses. It is the first of many houses for God. When God agrees to ensoul or inhabit a house, we call that house of God a temple. So this electronic body is a temple in which the living fire of your presence abides. All of that is you. It is a full-blown, bona fide identity that does have free will, divine free will, that by its very nature is self-aware, because its whole identity is wrapped up in its cognizing I am. So it has will, it has conscious awareness, and it has a heart overflowing with love. And it has and does act of its own initiative in ways that that presence chooses to act. And it just so happens that the presence, these mighty I am presences, have chosen to master every part of their kingdom, of the kingdom of God, including all of the footstool kingdoms of nature, such as this three-dimensional universe. That's one of the kingdoms that your I am presence has chosen to inhabit. The whole drama of the Garden of Eden was intended to be a perfect paradise without toil or labor, without fear or torment. It was intended to be a place where this God individualized self could enter into the outer realms of nature for the purpose of that self achieving mastery over those realms. We call those I am presences who choose to make this journey, we call them Godhead charioteers. And rather than it being some God external to themselves, each mighty I am presence sends forth its very own heart and its very own life into other vehicles. And for now, we're going to not address the concentric rings of fire that go by the name of the causal body, that are the storehouse of all the good that your God presence, either at the level of the mighty I am presence or at the level of your outer self, whatever level, wherever good has been done, it is all there in the storehouse of your causal body. We are going to address instead the periodic excursions or odysseys of your God self's heart into the outer world of nature as you know it. In fact, there are a number of intermediate realms that are still a part of nature that are subject to human beings' free will. Suffice it to say that there is a pouring forth of the heart of the God self that reaches down and draws to itself the materials of not only what you would consider the heaven world, which is where the causal body is, and the heaven world, which is where the Christ presence, which is that figure that stands behind the lowest figure. Those are perfect realms, but also the heart flame of this presence, receiving as it does the flow of the life of the I am presence. The heart flame of the presence enters into the drama of the divine incarnation and enters into the natural world, realms that perhaps you have not known exist. But just as there is an earth that is tangible and an atmosphere that, although you can't see it, you can feel it as the wind blows, so too there are realms of more rarefied materials that are suitable for use for the heart flame to express emotion. There are other realms that are suitable for the heart flame to express attention and thought. And so successively, each of these is incarnated by the individuality of the God self, sending forth its life, sending forth an expression of its heart, and drawing together. What do little babies do in this world? They start with their mother's milk, but they graduate to peas and creamed corn and mashed potatoes and all kinds of healthy and less than healthy types of food. And over a period of time, the assimilation of all of that material produces the physical body. So too, there is a body suitable for emotions that is built up out of the raw materials of that intermediate realm of emotion and intermediate realm of mind. And the heart flame then animates those vehicles. But whose heart is it? It is always, the true heart flame is always the heart of the I Am Presence. And so it is the individualization of the I Am Presence that has done what was recorded in Genesis and conveys the breath of life and takes the clay of the earth, what is known as the astral substance of the water elements, what is known as the psychic substance of the mind elements, assembles them into a body and unites them with the one and makes of the independent components a unity and a suitable vehicle through which, over the course of a lifetime, one lifetime, that life stream will have existence in the physical form. This is the great, great drama of the divine incarnation. It is a tremendous adventure. It is an odyssey. Remember, Homer wrote about a hero, Ulysses, or Odysseus, as he was known in Greece, who left his perfect, happy home at Ithaca and went forth on certain missions, and then lost his way on his way back home and wandered for a cycle of 10 years, searching, trying to get back home. And that whole story of the Odyssey was a parable about being born into this world and trying to get back home on the part of the embodied heart flame, which senses innately that it really belongs in the mighty I Am Presence of its own identity. You can see that although this process has stages and progressions, and may, if it's something that is foreign to you that you're hearing for the very first time, it might be swirling all about you in ways that make it hard for you to make sense of it. But you can also see that all of those questions that were posed to you at the beginning, that they all have answers. And there is a scientific advancement in understanding who you are and what exactly constitutes the proverbial so-called soul of man. In our understanding, in each of the reincarnations, a brand spanking new physical body is built up. a brand spanking new body of emotion, which you can't see, but some can see, is built up. A brand spanking new body of thought is built up in each and every lifetime. And they make up the personality of one embodiment. The mighty I Am presence never lets go of the part of itself that thinks abstractly, the part of itself that has some ability of intuition, the part of itself that is closest to the Christ presence, which is the figure of the Christ overshadowing the outer self, the part of itself that is the faculty of focus, deciding where the life that flows along and animates the body, the breath of life, that enables the mind to think, that enables the emotional body to have desire and feeling, the breath that allows the physical body to move, that allows will to operate and move the sinews and muscles and fires the synapses of the physical brain. All of this is lent to these bodies, furnished to them as creative life by the God presence. And at the end of an embodiment, the heart flame gathers up itself, gathers its robes about itself, and leaves off the hold that it has had for an entire embodiment on the physical. Then sequentially, the emotional is left off. Then the mental is left off. And those bodies go back to the components, the dust, if you will, of each of those respective elements. But that is not the self. That is not the identity. And it is not a process that is passively done by some external deity. It is something that is actively performed by the self, the God self, which has the ultimate authority and ability to do that for each life stream. The part that carries over and has carried over since your very first embodiment in the earth, your very first incarnation, that is the part that subset is really what human beings think of as their soul. And the last little bit that we'd like to share with you today is that since the mighty I Am presence is an individualization of the Godhead, necessarily all that that presence does, either at the levels of its perfect identity in the electronic body or the causal body or the Christ presence, those are forever perfect, but they are creative. And that creativity, that creative power does not stop being creative when the river of life, the tree of life, spills over into memory, attention, thought, desire, feeling, will, word, or deed. All of those are as creative in their own right as any of the acts that took place in the first 6 days of creation. Every man, woman, and child upon this world, whether they are aware of this or ignorant of it, makes no difference whatsoever. One and all are either blessed, or if they have not learned to master those energies, it will be for them a curse that is called, if you recall the story of the touch of Midas, he had the ability that whatever he touched instantaneously turned to gold. Of course, initially he thought that'd be a very good thing until he tried to eat an apple that turned to gold, or drink a glass of water that turned to gold, or embrace his beloved daughter and her body turned to gold. So the human race has high octane jet fuel as life that is extremely and supremely creative. So much so that every conscious or subconscious nuance that thinks a thought or feels a feeling or acts or speaks in any way is creative, either harmoniously and as a blessing or discordantly as a destructive momentum. And all of those things go out through the bodies, just like you exhale carbon dioxide into the air and have other excretions and secretions, so too thoughts and feelings are secretions from their respective bodies. Those go out as far as they can go, which fortunately is not into the realms of perfection, but they go out as far as they can. And if they're perfect, they come back as bread cast upon the waters that are multiplied, and you receive the just reward of those things. And having received that blessing, they continue on back where they came from, which is they came from your mighty I Am Presence, so they return to your mighty I Am Presence. And that is what is called good karma. You have created good karma by qualifying this life and sending it forth into the universe and having it bless other parts of life. Just like, remember those concentric rings of fire on the perfect sphere? They go out, but they can't go anywhere except to come back upon themselves. And that's what they do. Everything goes out and comes back. So in the case of the good, it goes all the way to where the good began in the good and the one, of the individualization of the good and the one, the mighty I Am Presence. Sadly, for the ignorance and rebellion of the majority of human beings, for whatever reason, they choose to be oblivious to this, to not take responsibility for the process, and willy-nilly engage in a whole range of activities that misqualify life destructively and discordantly. It passes through their four lower bodies first, goes out into the world, harms other parts of life, and then begins its inexorable, impersonal march forward. Remember that story of Edgar Allan Poe about the pit and the pendulum and how the walls kept closing in and closing in and closing in? That's the way discordant karma acts. It closes in and it takes up roost. The chickens come home to roost. And where do they roost? In the coop of the memory body. And then you feel all cooped up. You feel claustrophobic because you are forced to move through life in the exoskeleton of your own unregenerated soul. And all of the punishment, the various things that have been sown by you have come home and are there upon your consciousness as weights upon your consciousness. That would be a very terrible state of affairs if that was the end of the process. There are two things that can occur. The first is true forgiveness of so-called sins, which, by the way, sins are not a process where it's just thou shalt not. That's the old version of what sins are in the old dispensation. Any of you who are parents, how far does it get you when your child does something and you say, don't do that, and they say, why? And you answer, because I said so. Merely because I said so, that's why you shouldn't do it. That's the thou shalt nots in that sense. That's the old idea of God says it's wrong, it's a sin, therefore you can't do it. Certain things are clean, other things are unclean, arbitrarily. This new advancement is a spiritually scientific explanation that it's not so much that sin is something that ever exists in the pure and perfect mind of God, but it is rather the miscreation of the human race that have sown destruction, and that destruction comes back and would empty the cups of that destruction back onto the consciousness of the individual. The true meaning of forgiveness of sin is that the effects of that returning karma, the hand of God as a mercy and a grace, through one or more of the ascended masters, Jesus included, the angelic hosts and so forth, there is an arresting of that impact of that karma, that discordant karma. It is arrested. It is held in abeyance so that it does not overwhelm the person before they are able to deal with it. Notice that that description of forgiveness does not include doing away with the negative karma. Rather, forgiveness is a process where it is held in an arrested state, where its effects are not felt. And this is by the mercy of God in order to allow the light stream to rise up and to every single day deal with as much of that returning karma as they can without themselves being destroyed by all of it or too much of it coming back at one time. You might recall the parable of the debtor who was in debtor's prison, and the Lord to whom all of the debts were owed, received a petition from that debtor and asked if he couldn't be forgiven those sins, which did happen. And then that same person who'd been forgiven went out and throttled someone who owed him a mere pittance and grabbed him around the neck and said, "Pay me that thou owest." And when the original lord and lender found out about this, of course, he had the first debtor rearrested, cast back into prison to serve out his debtor's prison sentence. That illustrates the fact that forgiveness is not a doing away with the problem. It is not an ultimate purification. We do not have the time today to go into all of the mechanisms involved in the real process of purification, except to say that starting with the authority of your own mighty I Am presence, and with the assistance of the whole company of your brothers and your sisters who are already free in the ascended state, and with the assistance of the hosts of angels and archangels and others of the hosts of heaven, including the cosmic beings, they can lend their grace to your mighty I Am presence. And by the love of your presence, which that love can go forth and it can unwind the original process of the miscreation, undo it lock, stock, and barrel, so that all of the overlays of imperfection that have imprisoned the pure life of your own I am presence that flows along a channel that is referred to as the crystal cord, all of those misqualifications are redeemed. They are not just held in abeyance, but the debt is paid by the love of your mighty I am presence in what is known as the flames of transmutation. It is where one element of karma is transmuted into another element of good. It is more profound than changing lead to gold, but it is a transmutation that is performed by the authority, ultimately, of your own mighty I am presence, sending forth the love that spun it forth. This process of transmutation is a part of the divine plan, because any part of creation, once it has served its purpose, even if it was created perfectly, once it has served its purpose, it's not left alone to litter the universe with all kinds of trash by the side of the cosmic highways. All of that is, by divine design, from the very beginning, swept up in a whirlwind action of the all-consuming love of God, and all of the raw materials are returned to their original pristine state before the creation took place. But there has been a plus ultra that has been added, because there is now a new creation that takes place. This is a process that brings a tremendous sense of God freedom to the soul that is freed of its burdens of miscreation. It just so happens that this all-consuming love, in its intense power, vibrates, spiritually speaking, through the spectrum from a very electric purple bordering on a deep sapphire blue, through a real true violet, to a violet that is very much blended with the color of real love and compassion, which is pink. So that is called a mercy color, that blush of that pale lilac violet. So there's a whole spectrum of violets and purples and pinks that all are part of this all-consuming action of the love of God that puts forth the heart and hand of God and wipes away all of the appearance of miscreation and takes that burden out of the aggregate of the soul, the lost, fallen potential of the man, lifts it out of that and polishes it and makes it shine once again, facets it and puts it in either the green part of the causal body or the pink part or the blue part, wherever it's supposed to be. It puts it in there so that it can be used once again and used over and over again to enrichen every single part of life. So there you have it. You are this individuality. I will close on this point. If you, as part of the old dispensation of Christianity, have bought into the idea that you are essentially whatever this soul of you is, if you think that that's who you really are, you will protect that you. You will have an instinctive sense of self-preservation that you better not ever allow that soul to dissolve away. Because if the soul is you and the soul dissolves away, you will go out of existence along with it. that is why you must transfer your identification and your allegiance from identifying yourself as this creaturely soul created by a creatorly God, and realize that your real selfhood, your real identity, is unassailable and far more vast and perfect than you will ever know until you are one with it again. Your real self is your God presence. And you can be that God presence and be intact. You won't go into nothingness. Jesus taught this mystery to his disciples when he used the parable of a seed and was explaining that if you think yourself to be this one seed, if the seed holds on to itself real tightly, it doesn't ever be anything more than that one seed. That's the ego and the soul consciousness that has to feel that it has to be what it is as a soul, or otherwise it will be a non-entity. The truth of the matter is that it will be a non-entity, and that's a very good thing for it to be a non-entity. But you yourself will endure, because you are not that seed or soul. You are your mighty I Am presence. And the point is, when the seed agrees to give up the ghost to die, then it germinates and grows into a whole tree of life itself, of one type of fruit or many fruits, and it no longer is alone, but it brings forth much fruit. So when you give that up, when you think you're giving up your very selfhood and dying forever, as you go through the eye of the needle of that sense and turn yourself over to your own mighty I Am presence, you will find that the you that you are is multiplied until the hem of the garment of the identity that you are as your mighty I Am presence will envelop every other mighty I Am presence, every other ascended master, every other part of reality. And you, as that newly ascended one, will bring forth much fruit. Thank you.